But I think many of the other states, it tends to be production for local use. My doctoral studies were in regional economic development,
Well,
and they do go near suppliers.
Yeah, I was trying to correlate that whether our law is harsh, you know, you talked about the more severe, or somewhere in or decriminalized or harsh or somewhere in between, that doesn't seem to have much effect. It is whether there are users there, and for example with teens, whether they can profit by it, that seems to have the most dramatic impact on the market rather than the state law. In other words, the state law isn't acting much as a deterrent because there is more gain in teens selling to each other, and there's more gain.
Well, a couple of salient points there, sir.
Muddling through.
Well, no. You raise an interesting topic. Generally speaking, illegal commodity is priced at a much higher level than a legal commodity because of that risk factor that's built into it. Now, one of the interesting things about domestic marijuana cultivation has been the growth of indoor sales and the decentralization of the overall market. As a country, we used to buy all our marijuana overseas and bring it in. Now we tend to grow it here. There's been a cat and mouse game involving federal enforcement efforts, which has further atomized, decentralized production. People used to grow large plots outside, then it was small plots outside, then they moved inside. They moved from private land to public land. And as it spreads out into more and more places, okay, there are cartels bringing marijuana in from Mexico, no argument. But as more and more production is decentralized, it becomes more localized and shuts down some of these more extensive networks. But one point that I didn't raise earlier that I'd like just to briefly say now, this profit motive is very corrupting, and it's very corrupting to teenagers. It's like there's easy money out there. I don't have to work hard in school. I don't have to develop a profession. It's like the movies we see. It's like the kid in Goodfellas. You can live the good life without really working hard, and that has a very corrosive effect on the values of many of these at-risk teens that we're concerned about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Cole, any other? Yes, Dr. Gettman, if in looking at the marijuana in Indiana,
yes, sir,
document on page 7, could you help me understand what those numbers mean? You've got Indiana possession arrests 2007, for example.
Yes.
Marion County 2,309.
Right.
I assume that is a hard number. That's the number of possession arrests for Marion County in 2007.
Yes,
correct?
sir. According to the Uniform Crime Reporting Program.
Then we go down to Indiana County leaders in marijuana possession arrest rates.
Yes.
2007. The number for Bartholomew County, a county near and dear to me, is 474. What does 474 mean? Is that
per 100,000 residents?
Per 100,000 residents.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
And that's all as reported to the Uniform Crime Reporting Program.
Thank you. I don't want to make a ridiculous comparison, but several of the things you've said would be also true of a drug such as cocaine. You certainly have vast sums of money spent in attempted enforcement, which is not terribly effective. You also have certain populations being criminalized because of its use. It has a degree of acceptance in certain circles, and I think it may have some medical uses too. But I'm certainly not have no degree in pharmacology or medicine or anything such as that. Admittedly, cocaine is very difficult to grow in the United States. I understand that. So it's not necessarily domestic production. They both have disabling effects on people, such as driving automobiles, operating machinery, etc., like that. To what degree is there a similarity and what degree is there a contrast?
Well, that's something that I'm happy to address, but, experts in pharmacology would confirm, I think, there's a tremendous difference in the dependence liability of marijuana compared to cocaine. First of all. Second of all, just on a general health and safety basis, you can die from too much cocaine. You can't die from too much marijuana. Now, that's a very oversimplified and general statement. But this goes back to this little construction that Mr. Kaplan produced that I summarized, that's elaborated in more detail in his article. The social costs of marijuana use are demonstrably less than those of cocaine. Many people use marijuana without experiencing addiction problems. Now, there are people who have dependence problems with marijuana. Marijuana is abused. I have no argument about that. But to lapse out of an academic and in a more plain talk, cocaine's a very nasty drug. It has very dramatic effects, has very dangerous effects, and it has getting back into pharmacology, it has a much greater potential for abuse and a much stronger dependence liability. Now, we can produce for you literature comparing the addictive qualities of these drugs. There's a general consensus that the abuse potential of marijuana is much, much lower than that of cocaine. Also, personally, to give you an idea of what my values and my take on all this is, I don't believe that any drug users should be criminally sanctioned. I think drug abuse is a medical problem. When it comes to people who sell drugs, I don't believe that the sale of cocaine ought to be sanctioned by law. Now, many people in the drug reform movement would argue differently. Many people would say, would accept the premise of your question, that these arguments are the same for both drugs and there should be a wider set of reforms across the board. But I believe that marijuana is a more socially acceptable drug in that it is comparable to alcohol and tobacco, which we have made a social decision to tolerate and to address health problems by way of education campaigns and regulatory programs and what have you. I think that's really the crux here, is that we have a set of standards that we've already adopted explicitly with alcohol and tobacco. I think marijuana fits better with those two drugs. I think that pharmacologically you can make very strong distinctions between marijuana and cocaine.
Thank you.
I know you've studied the usage in various states, and I think, if I heard you correctly, that there doesn't seem to be too much difference in the usage between states with severe penalties and those with more lenient penalties. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
How about states that have changed penalties and gone from either what we call lenient to more severe? Has there been a reduction of usage?
That doesn't happen. States really have not increased the severity of their marijuana laws. Now, there may be one, but the overall trend, in the late 1960s, state governments realized, as more was learned about marijuana, there was a disconnect between the justification for very harsh penalties. The 1970 legislation of Congress creating the Controlled Substances Act also created the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. It's known as the Nixon Commission. They called marijuana arrests a crime of indiscretion. They recommended that marijuana be decriminalized nationally. This helped start this process by which we got these decrim states in the 1970s: California, Oregon, Nebraska, North Carolina, Mississippi example. And many other states, in the wake of that era, adopted conditional discharge policies, or they adopted prosecutorial discretion or sentencing discretion. Some states have very severe penalties on the books, but don't actually utilize them in sentencing. I think Florida has a 5-year penalty for marijuana possession. I think it's the most harsh in the country. I have a comparison of the penalties for 1 ounce and larger quantities in my report on arrests. But for the most part, no state that has done decrim has revoked that policy. Ohio has a very generous, in terms of amount, policy of decrim, roughly 3 to 3.5 ounces of marijuana, and they've had that for 25, 30 years now, and they don't want to change it. Most states are happy with low
I guess
enforcement
what I'm
levels.
really asking is when states change policies, does it seem to have any impact on usage, either when they raise the penalties or whether they lower the penalties?
No one has been able to report a consistent relationship between the
Penalties
two.
don't have a deterrent effect on usage.
That is
what you're
correct.
saying?
Yes. And by the way, in my arrest report, I have a nice little graph that illustrates, I think, an important point here. Because you're kind of asking, basic academic thing of, you have a baseline, you have a program or a treatment, and you have an effect afterwards, and can you see a difference between, before and after? Here's an experimental model for you. In the 1990s, we doubled, in the United States, we doubled the number of marijuana arrests throughout that decade. And we're doing it again, almost again in this decade. But in the 1990s, we doubled marijuana arrests nationally, no effect at all on the level of marijuana use in this country.